Hello everyone, this is Pico Entertainment and we are back again, and here now we have another video for you, and this will be a review of the Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power Season 1. Now there'll likely be spoilers in this review, so just beware when going into this overall video. Now as you mostly know, Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power is a prequel fantasy series based on the acclaimed fantasy novel books created by J.R.R. Tolkien. This was a medieval fantasy set in the land of Middle-earth that centred on the races of men, hobbits, dwarves and elves, all uniting together to destroy the Ring of Power and prevent the dark forces of Lord Sauron from taking over Middle-earth. The series was brought into greater cultural reference with Peter Jackson's movie adaptation, which started from 2001 and went through all the way to 2003, and still remains for me and most fans within movies as the greatest cinematic trilogy of all time. Now, huge headlines were made when Amazon purchased the rights of the franchise way back in 2017 for over $250 million. And ever since that purchase, there's been much hype and also much criticism and worry as to whether this would be another failed adaptation of a fan-beloved franchise. Now, the series itself is set thousands of years before the events of Lord of the Rings, where we follow a huge multitude of characters and their own individual stories. Now, the main plot focuses on warrior elf Galadariel, who has been on a vengeful quest for many centuries to track down the dark force of Lord Sauron, who was responsible for the death of her brother during an age-long battle when the elves ventured out of the lands to take on the dark forces. Galadriel gains allies such as Queen Muriel, who rules over Numenor. We also follow the story of another elf, Elrond, who forms a friendship with the dwarf known as Durin the Fourth, who is the eventual prince. We also follow the tale of elven warrior known as Anodare, who we see evades capture from a group of orcs and develops a relationship with a woman known as Bronwyn, and he eventually joins Galadriel as well. We also follow a group of half-foots, essentially known as the Hobbits within the universe, who come across an old man who has fallen from a flaming meteor in the sky, and throughout the series we learn of his eventual powers and abilities as well. So after much debate and scrutiny and buzz and skepticism, does Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power exceed expectations as a franchise adaptation, or does it prove to be yet another disappointing attempt to continue a once beloved franchise? Now, I'm probably going to lean slightly towards more the latter option. I know there's been a lot of negative reaction and coverage and supposed outrage over this series. Many have claimed it to be a disaster, an abomination and a complete train wreck. Now, I definitely wouldn't go that far to that extreme, but for me, if I had to describe Rings of Power, I would say overall that it's underwhelming. And when you consider the size and scope of the mythology and universe, the huge amount of budget and resources used into the series, it just hasn't had the impact that you would expect from any Lord of the Rings adaptation. Now, from a more positive point of view, I think the show looks great aesthetically. We do get some great shots visually of the world, in terms of the mountainsides and the castles and the environments, and again, that's what you would expect from a budget of this size. So on a surface level, the show is produced very well. There's very little issue in terms of the scope and the music and the action sequences. Whilst not captivating quite the same majesty of Peter Jackson's trilogy, there are certain sequences such as the elves leaving for Valinor in episode 1, a truly stunning shot where we see the ship really bask in all of the sunlight. There's another sequence in the 6th episode where we see the devastation from the volcanic opening of Mordor. So at least from the visual standpoint, the show is very pleasing on the eye and to a certain degree does justify or visualise what Middle-earth should look like. But if we really look at what's failed this show, and I think overall the biggest issue is that it lacks a certain focused and compelling narrative. The story constantly jumps from a multitude of characters, not really letting you get fully immersed in them or their journey. 5 minutes we spend on Galadriel, then we shift to Elrond and Darwin, then we shift to the Half-Foots, and then we shift to Anodare. And if you're watching it, you really are asking yourself, what are we heading towards? Where exactly is the story going? Now, we did start off the series initially on Galadriel's quest for vengeance, and had we stayed on that arc with others joining her quest, that probably would have been far more of a compelling story. We do get a prologue sequence in the beginning episode, a bit similar to what we saw in Peter Jackson's films, and honestly when I look at the events that are told during this sequence, I would have much preferred if we had visualised them in multiple episodes. But as the show goes on, we continually take detours to other characters who really have very little significance or importance in terms of the story. And we spend so much time on these characters, it just made me lose interest in what was happening in each individual episode. Now, in jumping across so many characters across multiple locations in such a scattershot fashion, it really took away a lot of the compelling edge towards the story. Now, what made the Peter Jackson trilogy so special is that, of course, with that incredible prologue sequence that we saw in the Fellowship of the Ring, we establish immediately the threat of the ring and Lord Sauron, and that the ring has to be destroyed, and that all of Middle-earth is at stake. The ultimate goal is the ring, and every character involved had their own agenda or motivation towards it, whether it was to save Middle-earth or whether it was to attain the ring for their own desires. So every character felt important to the story, which as a result kept you watching. But with Rings of Power, you could easily cut out 2/3 of the character cast, and the story would have a lot more urgency and definitely be a lot leaner as well. And speaking of leanness, the episode runtime itself was far too long, running a lot of the time in between 60 and 70 minutes long. And I really did feel the length when watching this show. Again, because of the scattershot narrative and the unfocused story, it really felt like each episode was trying to be an epic movie on the same level of Peter Jackson's movies. Now, the show did manage to have a sustained momentum in and around episode 6, where we see the elves and villagers come under attack from the orcs before Galadriel's forces come in to rescue them. And then we see the creation, if you like, of Mordor with that volcanic explosion. And that was the one time during the show where we really had a sense of high stakes, intensity and tension. And sadly, the series couldn't build from that cliffhanging moment. We then talk about another big issue, and that was Galadriel herself. As the primary lead character, she unfortunately was a massive blank slate. Now, the showrunners clearly wanted to make her super stoic and strong and fearless, but as a result, she lacks any real endearment or emotion as a character. She says the lines and the dialogue, she has all of the fight scenes, but you never truly feel it. This is just a character that you don't really want to get behind or have any emotional weight or connection to. Now, I know it's unfair to make constant comparisons to Jackson's movies, but when we look at that trilogy and Cate Blanchett's interpretation of Galadriel, her version just radiated so much awe and beauty and gravitas. She didn't need to be involved in any fights or action sequences to emphasise just how powerful she was. You just felt it with her presence every time that she was on screen. Now, you don't get any of that in the Rings of Power version, and I don't really blame the actress, Morfydd Clark, as she's proven competent in other roles. I just think it's the way that the character is written overall. We then talk about the season finale, and to be honest, it didn't really amount to much. All that mainly happened was that the stranger, who I think most fans of this universe have clearly identified as Gandalf, went on to help the Harfoots, saving them from a group of dangerous warriors. We then see the Harfoot known as Nomi accompanying the stranger on a set journey, leaving her family and friends behind. We then see the forging of 3 of the rings from the elves as they recognise the ongoing threat within Mordor, and then we get the final reveal that the soldier known as Halbrand, who has been an ally of Galadriel, is actually the person who will go on to be consumed by the dark force of Lord Sauron, and then we get the final shots again of him departing away into the land of Mordor. And overall, as an episode, it wasn't bad, but it was just a bit underwhelming. It really felt more like a montage rather than an actual episodic story itself. And when I look at what happened, it wasn't really that much. It really could have been wrapped up in about 20 minutes, again highlighting the problem that I stated before, that these episodes just dragged on too much, and the story was never there to justify the overall length. So there was no real cliffhanger moment, no real dangling plot threads to leave you invested for Season 2, which has already been confirmed, and it was also announced that Season 2, whilst currently filming, won't be able to be seen on our screens for at least another 2 years. So if I had to give an overall score for Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, I would give it a 5.8 out of 10. Again, I'm not going to the extreme that many have stated that it's a disaster or it's the most awful adaptation ever. There's been way worse adaptations of iconic franchises than Lord of the Rings. Again, it did have the visual scope, it did have really good music. There were certain sequences that came close to matching the awe of Peter Jackson's movies. And whilst none of the characters really connected with me, I don't think it was the fault of the actors. I just think, again, it was the way that the story was written. And to be fair, I knew straight away when they announced that they were producing this series that it wouldn't come anywhere close to matching the Peter Jackson trilogy. But I think just in general as a show itself, I will probably stick with the first couple of episodes to Season 2 just to see if there's any improvement, if they can actually produce a much more focused and streamlined story to match the huge production values, because there is huge potential when you're looking at Lord of the Rings. If you can get the story right and if you can get the characters right, then there is still a chance that they can produce something special, and one would definitely hope so with a huge budget this size. So that's my overall thoughts and feelings and review of the first season of Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, the prequel series to Lord of the Rings. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you were a major fan of Lord of the Rings in general, was this series a disappointment to you, or do you see potential and room for improvement? And do you feel that with multiple seasons it can truly become the great fantasy series that we would want it to be in terms of Lord of the Rings? Or do you think it's been a complete bust, and once again highlights the fact that these owners and creators really have no idea in terms of the franchise and its identity? And do you think it's another case to state that we should be seeing far less prequels and reinterpretations and sequels, and far more newer content and newer shows and newer ideas? Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you have any other television shows or series or movies or any other topics that you'd like to see me cover within the channel, then also let me know, and I can see if I can provide further commentary for you on those topics within the future on the channel. Please also hit and like the subscription and notification buttons so I can provide you with more high quality content like this in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, stay at safe distances, and I will see you very, very soon.